global society present here, professors from all over the world, politicians, men of the clergy. I'm very elated to be amongst you, to also listen to many of your views. And I was very elated to hear how you are trying to play important roles in maintaining peace in your own country. And that's a very important step in building peace. My name is McHenry Benani. I have no card in front of me. It was an omission because I was the late arrival. So I have excused those that have not done so because they were not sure whether I would be arriving or not. Good. Okay. Yeah, the name is not McHenry, but it's McHenry, Scottish. And the surname is Venani, the rest are all family names. But be that as it may, I serve as a opposition leader of the Republic of Namibia. I'm a farmer by profession, also a scholar of law, reading law, postgraduate levels around the world. Today we are talking about how development, peace, and elections interlink in Africa and what the future holds for Africa. Fundamentally, I want to state that Africa is a continent on the move. The political architecture of the African continent is stabilizing. If you look at what Africa was in the 90s and what Africa is today in terms of peace and conflict resolution, one is seeing a much more stable, more predictable Africa as in the years before. Many years in the 80s, especially in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and more in the 90s, coup d'etats was a political norm on the African continent. One should state, as a matter of fact, that coup d'etats have no longer become a norm. They have become an exception at this point in time. Because lesser and lesser governments are taken by coups, and those that are taken by coups are vilified by institutional frameworks that exist in Africa, such as the AU Political Commission, the AU Political Commission on Security, and the AU Commission itself would vilify a party that takes power by force. Now, taking back to what has stabilized Africa. I think what has stabilized Africa is the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, and to create a much more robust union that deals with security matters on the continent. And I think that has really helped the stabilization process of the African Union. To the credit of regional bodies such as ECOWAS that is leading it, they have also been able to play a critical role in stabilizing various parts of Africa. Now, we are seeing at this point in time a decline from 14 conflicts in 1980 to nearly 4 conflicts, major conflicts, on the African continent today. The hotspots today are the DRC, the Congo situation that is unavoidable, the crisis of many troops that are in the regions of South Kivu, North Kivu, and so forth. The Somalia situation that is moving towards stabilization, but is also a crisis zone. The worriest of all of them is South Sudan, a newest state of Africa that is really transgressing and going back to a failed state. And I think the biggest worry on every political actor on the African continent is South Sudan, because we are really worried about the displacement of refugees, women and children, and the ongoing unresolved conflict between the forces of Riek Machar on the one hand, down the vice president, the conflict in one group, and the SPLM under Salva Kiir. And then the Nigerian crisis remains looming large, although it is subsiding. The Boko Haram, the extremism versus terrorism extremists, the Boko Haram group seems to really cause a big part of instability on the northern parts of Nigeria. Now, what leads to the situation of this fragility of peace on the African continent? I think one of the reasons is many of our states are very fragile. Many African states are fragile because the institutions of our countries are not strong. It is the strong man, Monsieur le President culture. The presidents, the leaders are stronger than institutions of society. And that is one of the biggest challenging peace on the African continent. We have fragile economies. A lot of our economies are subsistence economies. They are not diversified, they are not strong, and they do not really answer to the social demands of our society. We have a youth bulge. The youngest population of the world lies in Africa. And over 75% of this youth bulge is unemployed, undereducated and unemployed. So that's a challenge to peace and stability on the African continent. We have seen democratic transitions that have become a recurrent processes. We are seeing a transition of power from one leader to another, and I'll come to elections. But we are seeing a stabilizing political architecture of the African continent. That you are seeing a president leaving power and moving towards giving towards another leader. But I think one cannot address fully and contextualize African fragility without addressing the economic challenges challenging the African continent. And I think the biggest economic challenge is the weak education that I spoke about. That many of our young people have no future because they are not trained. And then our education systems in many of our states are not geared to create artisanship, people that can be able to do things with their hands. We are not creating vocational training as a means to educate the young. And most of the time our education system only focuses on creating lawyers and professors, and the very few that we are creating, and we are not creating the artisan that needs to take Africa out of poverty and for Africa to be able to do things with their hands. Now the economic conundrum on the African continent has led to a new wave of a new occupation of the Chinese. The Chinese have taken over the African economy. Where the Africans are failing, we are not creating the jobs on the African continent, we are importing jobs from China. So China is taking a very center stage on the African development. On the one hand, they are giving soft loans to our governments to create the necessary infrastructure that we need. But they are also competing with our domestic demands. And they are taking those domestic demands, and African populations and leadership ought to guard against protecting the jobs on the shores of the African continent. We are seeing a lot of Africans moving. Last night there was an article that really disheartened my heart, again, of Africans moving across the Mediterranean seeking better futures, and they are risking their lives knowing that they could die. And the reason why they are risking their lives is that the African leadership is not providing the economic solutions towards that. The economic situation is so bad that we are not diversifying enough. And the only economies that are growing in sub-Saharan Africa are those that have tried to diversify and to go into manufacturing. Countries such as Kenya are trying that route. Ethiopia is leading in that route of diversification. And those countries can survive. The biggest countries, the biggest economy on the African continent, which is Nigeria and South Africa, are falling way behind. And their growth is a challenge to the whole sub-Saharan Africa, because if those two economies are falling behind, a lot of other economies that are interlinked to those economies are also going to do very poorly. But two issues are very fundamental, and I think we discussed them in the morning. And that is the question of the lack of modernization of the agricultural sector. Because we have a youth bulge that needs jobs, we have a agricultural potential that is so huge, and we are not marrying the two. We are not marrying the two, and we need to do something to marry the two. Secondly, there is also an untalked and unorthodox deficit on the African economy, and that is the deficit created by illicit financial outflows and transfer pricing by Western companies that are operating in Africa. That Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is losing nearly every year over $2 trillion of its resources through illicit financial outflows and transfer pricing of international multinational companies of the world. So a much more robust language is needed on the African continent to make sure that we recover these illicit financial outflows that we are losing. Because if $2 trillion is reinvested on the African continent, then 8 does not become a factor anymore, because we could be able to finance our own socio-economic trajectory with the resources that Africa has. Of course, the question of diversification of the economy I spoke about, and value addition, is very key towards propelling our economies, and those are things that needs to be done to really ensure peace on the African continent. Because I think what the great agricultural revolutionists that you spoke about spoke of an empty stomach, and you cannot maintain peace with an empty stomach. So all these factors of fragility creates an unstable political environment on the African continent. I want to briefly end and give to my co-chair, briefly address the question of elections development on the African continent. Must I say that old habits die hard? We have habits that are in Africa that are dying very hard. The biggest concern at this point in time on the African continent is politicians gerrymandering and involving themselves with constitutional amendments to extend term limits. Every country is talking about their president that wants to extend their term limit. And this is a big challenge to the electoral processes on the African continent, that politicians are no longer maintaining the rule of law, they are maintaining the rule of men. And they are using the rule of law to maintain the power of the rule of men. Because when legal authors start arguing that, in fact, we made a mistake and that's why we want to extend the term, because then we were negotiating this. Why did you put term limits? The very reason why we put term limits is that we are coming from a particular history in Africa where leaders stayed in power for too long. And therefore we say, for a new Africa to be revived, let's create term limits. We were very deliberate. And this is how the culture of term limits was created in the country. But a lot of countries are regressing and are moving back. Chad is one country. The president of Chad is going for a 5th term. Congo-Brazzaville President Denis Sassou Nguesso is in power for the last 32 years. And he has won a new term to continue that. Mugabe is one. At least in Angola we are seeing a new development, albeit very late, that Dos Santos wants to hand over power after 38 years in power. So the term limit conundrum is a serious challenge. There were also successes, if you look at the electoral processes on the whole African continent, where you had 10 incumbents that retained power and 6 new presidents emerge. But the biggest challenge of the emergence of these leaders is a lack of credible electoral commissions. We are sitting with electoral commissions that buys favors with the powers that be. A person who is appointed a member of the electoral commission or the chairperson always nearly have a link, direct and indirect, to those that are in power. So the credibility of the electoral commissions, it's a serious matter that needs to be addressed on the electoral reforms that are needed. Our Kenyan brothers have been very vocal on the African continent, really talking about how the electoral body is not working in the interest of the populace and in the interest of the country. And I think they have achieved some of the reforms under very strenuous conditions. I remember Prime Minister Raila Odinga being tear-gassed on the streets of Nairobi and so forth and so forth. So it took a lot of challenges. So that is also a very important impediment that is hampering electoral fairness on the African continent. And then the opposition is under siege and under pressure. Nearly all effective opposition leaders across the country, countries on Africa, are censored, persecuted. Today we are sitting with a Zambian example of a Zambian opposition leader, Hakainde Hichilema, who's in prison because his convoy did not give way to the convoy of the president, and he is charged with treason. If you see the clip of those two convoys, you would laugh at it. because it is just one presidential convoy passing another one. No fights, no nothing. But because he didn't move off the road, he's in prison for the last 1 month now. The same with Kizza Besigye of Uganda. I can name a lot of opposition leaders that are under siege, that are not allowed to practice the real political work. Tanzania was one of the countries that was a beacon of democracy. Under President Magufuli, we are seeing that political parties are no longer allowed to have rallies in Tanzania. And it was the model, the bedrock of democracy was Tanzania. And they are regressing because there is no freedom of association any longer, because everything is controlled by President Magufuli. So these are some of the challenges. Access to media becomes a serious contentious issue on the African continent. In my country, when you go to elections, the party that won the last election result would get more airtime. So the election result is already predetermined by the previous result. So there is no fairness and access to the media. And you don't, and 90% of the media is controlled by the state, and the state decides what information is fed to the populace. So the narrative of the incumbency always remain and emerge victorious in the papers. So these are some of the problems that we have. The biggest challenge also to opposition leaders, and I don't want to exclude this, is that there is also a lack of seriousness of opposition parties in preparing themselves towards elections. More so, you would find political opposition leaders only rising 7 months before an election. And that's a challenge to opposition leaders. That after every election, there is another election. That preparation should be there. Of course, there is a lack of access to funding, which is a serious fundamental challenge to many opposition parties. But elections are not only won by money. They are also won by political programs that you must have throughout the whole electoral cycle. The electoral cycle only begins after the election has ended. So opposition politicians should also rise to the score of becoming serious on the African continent. Lastly, before I give over to my brother, co-chair, is the bogus voters list. There are very few countries on the African continent that can say that we have credible voters list. The voters list will always contain ancestors and ancestors of ancestors on the list. Dead people are always on our voters roll. Now, if you ask my country's electoral commission before an election, 3 weeks before an election, how many Namibians are going to the polls, you'd get 3 figures. Today, this week is this figure, tomorrow is this figure. Now, how many people have registered? You are getting 3 figures. So I think we need to do more. Electoral commissions should do more to create the necessary system of accountability. Lastly, it's the observer missions that we send to countries. Sometimes observers, and I am a very well experienced observer, having observed a number of elections around the continent and further afield. Sometimes observers, especially on the African continent, comes into a country, stays in hotels, being dined by the state that be, and declare reports in hotel without really assessing the necessary conditions on the ground. And I think observer missions should really look at their purpose of coming into countries. We are not there to come and criticize, but we are coming to countries to come and assess according to the tenets of AU, according to the tenets of SADC or ECOWAS, and we must make sure that we conform to those tenets so that we do not come into hotel rooms and say that the election is free and fair while people are killing each other outside. With these few remarks, I want to hand over to my co-chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Chair. And as the co-chair, I think basically I will be very brief. Most of my intervention will be from the question that might be asked. I'm Gabriel B. Smith from Liberia, a parliamentarian of both the Liberian legislature and the Pan-African Parliament. I have chaired the Committee on Elections at my legislature for the past 11 years. And so I have a little appreciation about the electoral system in my country and to some extent within West Africa. To address the issue of development, elections and peace. And in my view, we need to basically consider the correlation between and amongst these three elements. Considering that my colleague had dealt to a large extent with development, I will just basically start with elections. The very first thing is that election is a democratic element, like we all know. It is a process that must meet three basic criteria to be considered as being credible. An election has to be transparent, it has to be free, it has to be fair. It must be conducted within a given or well-defined legal framework. And that is something I'd like us to take note of. Because to a large extent, the fairness or transparency or credibility of any electoral process is dependent on the legal framework. When the legal framework is flawed, of course you don't expect to get a clean election out of the flawed electoral legal framework. And so, for example, in Liberia, in our constitution, chapter 1, article 1 is clear that all power is inherent in the people, and all free government are instituted by their authority, and they may alter such a government as their happiness may so demand. Meaning that a government is expected to be responsive to the needs of the people. And once the government fails to do that, the people have a will to change such a government through the process of election. Now, for the past 11 years in West Africa, most West African states have to a large extent done well with respect to electoral reform. Quite recently, we were in Benin, where we did an assessment of the progress being made at the West African region in holding successful democratic elections. And the one problem we had is the problem of Gambia, which almost spoiled the record that West Africa has made over the past 11 years. But thank God for the intervention of ECOWAS to ensure that indeed the person who was democratically elected by his people actually had to receive the mantle of leadership. What is the purpose of election? Why do we go to election? Election is a process of giving voice to the people in a democratic society. Because democracy, as defined and clearly presented by one of our presenters yesterday, Professor Shu, democracy must be a government by the people, of the people, and for the people. And the only way by which the government can be by the people is when they have a free will to choose who governs them or who represents them in the governing architecture of their country. And so this is why election is very important. And as I said from the beginning, election must satisfy three basic conditions, and the election must be free. What does it mean for the election to be free? To be free should mean that every eligible citizen qualified under your legal structure or by your law, whether the Constitution or the electoral law, must be allowed to exercise that free will without hindrance. Secondly, in an electoral system, there must be educated, or there must be clearly provided information to the electorate through the process of civic voters education. Because one key element of democracy is knowledgeability. When the people are not knowledgeable, when they do not understand what they are doing, then of course democracy faces a risk. And so in an electoral democracy, it is important that the citizens be clearly informed as to their rights and limitations, as to what they ought to do to ensure that they can exercise that right. Thirdly, it is difficult, and we must say this clearly, for democracies to actually survive in an impoverished society. Why? Because we say election must be based upon informed consent of the people. The people must be informed, they must know what they are going to do, and they must exercise that free will. But when you are really poor, poverty is a kind of a form of mental enslavement. And so this is why, like my colleague said, some politicians come about 6 to 7 months to election. Why do they come out so late? They go around, borrow money, accumulate sufficient resources, and during electionary period, they come and give gifts. Buy materials, provide t-shirts, and people follow after them. And of course, I need to mention that it is such a process that entrenches the corruption in the African society. How does it do it? The guy goes out and he borrows, say, $5 to $6 million to run an election, and he wins as the president. The very first obligation he has is not to the electorate, but to his lenders, those that he's borrowed from, to repay that loan.
Sure.
And so what does he do? Begin to mortgage the resources of the country at the expense of the people. And so the way our electoral processes are run in Africa, to a large extent, affects the way that the governing architecture is also exercised. The next thing is that the electorate themselves, they have a problem that must also be recognized. The unnecessary demands that are made by our electorates also affect how the governing structure runs. How does that happen? Again, as I said, a candidate who comes to you without a platform, but he comes with money or gifts. So there is nothing for you to hold a person back. All he feels he has bought the job from you. He pays you money, he gives you gift, he buys food for you, t-shirt, drinks, and you voted him. So there is no contract that binds you and this person because he has already given you a gift for the vote you gave him. That is the perception that many African politicians hold. And so when they are elected, that social contract that should bind both the electorate and the elected, that contract does not exist in the mind. Why? Because I have paid you for your vote. And so that I use the power as I will. So we need to actually look at if Africa must be democratized. If Africa must make democratic progress, we have to address the issue of poverty on the continent of Africa, and one issue I think needs to be considered. And how do we address the issue of poverty that affects Africa? One key issue there is, which is a perennial issue that has affected Africa, is underdevelopment. The lack of resources. Lack of resources, not in the context that Africa does not have natural endowment. No, we do have. But the way our economic system is designed and run, we extract and we export. And some developing economists have said that the LDCs, meaning the least developed countries of the world, will remain underdeveloped as long as we do not go into the process of industrialization through the process of pre-export value addition. The more we export our resources, the more we create jobs in Europe, America, and Asia, and Africa is left underdeveloped. And so of late, in 2014, at the Pan-African Parliament, at one of our sessions, we're considering the issue of development on the continent of Africa, and the issue of industrialization arose. But we're discussing the context of the migration on the continent of Africa. What our young people are leaving, sacrificing themselves, dying in the Mediterranean and other places. Because African leaders, we have not come up with an idea of maintaining our citizens back home. It's like a man who has a family and you cannot provide for your family. You don't expect your children to stay home and starve to death, no. They will obviously go in the neighbor's yard, and that's what Africa is doing to its youthful population. And so I think one way by which we can, or our partners in Europe, America, and Asia, can help Africa to transform positively is to ensure that they help us in producing or manufacturing our resources here in Africa. We have a clear example. As bad as Charles Taylor was in Liberia, under the Taylor regime, Taylor told a company called OTC, the Oriental Timber Corporation. They were in the extractive industry, extracting our logs and exporting them. He said, look, enough is enough. You will process the wood here in Liberia, you will produce timber, you will produce plywood. And the plywood company was established within my district. Plywood was as cheap as $2.50 on the street of Buchanan. Why? Because it was being manufactured there in our country. More jobs were provided. And the more jobs you provide for your people through industrialization, the more resources you put in their pocket, the more taxes they pay to government, the more income government has, and government can undertake infrastructure development and other forms of development such as education, health, and other areas. And so Africa, if Africa must go beyond this stage, we must have to industrialize. That is the way to solve our problem of economic growth and development. The third thing which I do not need to talk about because he spoke about it lengthily, that is agriculture. Africa is endowed with water resources. Water resources we have in abundance. We have forests, we got good soil. How can we harness all of these and transform them into material development for our continent? That is something that Africa needs to consider. Because I believe if Africa can invest hugely in agriculture, and we begin to produce and manufacture within and create the inter-African trade we're talking about, Agenda 2063, which I think is too far away. But if we can take a step towards Agenda 2063 by industrializing, going towards industrialization, inter-African trade, creating trade link between countries to countries, and Africa becomes to be interconnected by trade, Africa's challenge of underdevelopment, in my view, will be solved. And how does that contribute to peace? It's often said in my own country that a hungry man is an angry man. And so a nation that cannot feed its people breaks the undercurrent of instability. You may have a semblance of peace on the periphery, but deep under, once the people are angry, once they are hungry, any little thing can stir them up. And African leaders are clearly knowledgeable about that. And this is reason for which, in my view, African leaders to a large extent prevent demonstration by other people. Because they know that they have made the population angry enough. So if you allow them to demonstrate, the hungry people jump in. And once they jump in, it goes out of order. It happened in my country in 1979. The rest riot. It was a peaceful demonstration that started by the demonstrators. G. Barker Matthews, Amos Sawyer, D. Twan Ware. They started. Their motive was clear. They wanted to sound to the government that indeed they did not have to increase the price of rice. The government needed to hear them. But in the midst of that, what happened? The hungry people joined in because they were already angry. That government was about to increase the price of rice. It resulted into a bloody demonstration in our country. And so, I'd like to conclude by saying, Africa indeed has made some degree of progress in democratization. We started off right after the period of colonialism in Africa, when democratic government started to be set up. People felt that power must be for only the political leader that was in charge. People began to rule for over 23 to 5 terms. That was challenged. We had coup, of which my country is a victim. We killed one of our presidents. And after the period of coup in Africa, we had what we call revolution, rebel war. That we're also a victim of that. We have war on our country. That period has passed. Africa is now moving towards democracy. But for this democracy to take root in Africa, these 3 things must be solidified. There must be education on the continent of Africa. There must be wealth creation on the continent of Africa and poverty alleviation. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you very much. I open this debate for questions, ameliorations, additions, and comments so that we start rolling the debate. The floor is open. Yes, my brother from Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased listening to the two presenters. I see exactly you represent the problems of Africa. Thank you very much. The narrative of Africa, the story is the same everywhere, almost everywhere. Every country has its own challenge. You know, for me in Africa, I can say somehow our country is struggling with democracy, but somehow it's also working in its own way, because we saw after the war a democratically elected government handing over power to opposition peacefully. That was why when we are talking this morning here about leaders in Africa, I mentioned the late man Ahmed Jankaba, because his party, our party, kept accusing him that he broke the party, he did not love the party, but he was somehow principled that yes, if the opposition win, they won. You have to give them the powers. You do not have to suppress them. The opposition had problems. They were fighting. He called on United Nations. He spent a lot of money on that, government money, subvented the opposition party to function properly. What a beautiful democracy. That can hardly happen in Africa. He formed committees, religious committees, saying you have to talk to these guys. For us to practice real democracy, for us to have the checks and balances, we need the opposition. So he has to fix the opposition. And unfortunately for us, or fortunately for the political system, they won. And they said, oh, this guy sold out the political party that he represents. But that was not the case. You know, I can be the devil's advocate. That was not the case. That was just for him to practice proper democracy that we needed to move from where we are 40, 50 years ago to a proper democratic system. But what I want to say here that you actually failed to mention is the fact that in Africa, I don't know for most European countries, but for like in UK, the opposition parties are subvented from the government budget. But in Africa, the opposition parties do not have the adequate resources to even function as an opposition party, to support, to finance their own very activities. While the government has access to all the resources, the ruling government, the ruling parties. So this is one major problem, challenge to democracy in Africa, because the opposition cannot raise the resources to even challenge, to put forward activities, plans, programs that can challenge or that can match government activities, because they don't have the resources. So that is one major problem with opposition parties in Africa and for our democracy. And also, I always talk about internal democracy. When you look at opposition parties in Africa, most opposition parties in Africa, they are doing infighting. There have been no internal democracies, even within the opposition parties. Mostly, even within the opposition parties, they prefer doing coronation of certain individual. You know, they coronate him. You know, hold political parties or political parties' activity to ransom, because people have this tendency that, oh, this guy is an opposition leader and he has spent a lot of long time in the party, so he's going to be there. Whether you like it or not, he's going to be there. So they will kill all the internal democratic processes by choosing their own very leader to represent them at the national election. So sometimes what happens, when you are presenting this kind of coronated leader for the national front, it's not respected. So it's a big problem for democracy also. You know, so these are some of the problems in our country and for other African countries I have seen.
Can you just limit your comments so that we allow others?
Okay, fine. Then also we are talking about the development, the economy for Africa. I think there is one major problem we have, and which I think, in my opinion, African leaders need to sit with the West, because we are talking about technology. I want to talk about technology in Africa. Technology is one of the major problems lacking in Africa for our activities, particularly towards payment system. We always sit here and say Africa is corrupt. And to me, I think everywhere is corrupt. But if you look at the payment system fixed in the Western countries, because they know if somebody is dealing with cash, money, there are tendencies that this person might steal this money. So they are a very rigid payment system, fixed in the Western countries. But Africa countries is very porous. We are very porous in terms of handling money. So that's why we always say Africa is corrupt. So I think we need a lot of technology in terms of dealing with agriculture, in terms of our payment system, and all of these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that comment. Can we allow more other comments before we reply? Two more. Ms. Grace.
Thank you very much. Seems like everyone is complaining from his region, from his country. Do you think the creation of the United States of Africa would end this democratic problem you are dealing with?
That's a huge one.
That's a good question.
Take a day or two.
Can you
Can we
answer?
allow more others? Yes, bro. Yes,
I
bro.
think that we have to recognize that some of the problems facing African political parties, especially what my colleague has talked about as internal democracy, are germane to almost all political parties, not just in Africa. I lived in Chicago in the 1970s, and if you are to stand for any post for the elections, either in Chicago municipality or city, or nationally, you had to contend with the democratic machine. And the machine chose the candidates. So the machine decided who was standing, and the machine decided who was not standing. So the problem of internal democracy is something, to me, that is not unusual to Africa. That's one. Secondly, it is not necessarily more democratic for political parties to use universal suffrage to choose their candidate for an election. In fact, it is the most problematic way of choosing candidates. It produces more problems for political parties than is necessary. And we can learn from the British system. Now, before Blair was Prime Minister, the Labour Party used to have this competitive process of nominating candidates. The Conservatives didn't. So the Conservatives kept on beating the Labour Party election after election. Why? Because by the time they went to the elections, Labour Party members would have fought so viciously in the primaries. By the time they go to the election, there's so much division and conflict within the Labour Party that if you lost in the Labour primaries, you are so disgruntled that you are much more likely not to campaign for Labour, but you are much more likely to campaign for the Liberal or somebody else. Labour realized that Conservatives were much more clever than themselves, so they decided to use the Conservative way of nominating candidates. In other words, the Parliamentary Labour Party decides, this is a safe seat, we shall take you to go there. There is no primary. The way they do it is that throughout the year, they study individuals and they study constituencies. And they decide that this is a safe constituency, this is a marginal constituency, this is a constituency where it is hopeless to field a candidate. The Conservatives are powerful anyway. So you put people there who will try and fend for themselves. Now, in Kenya, we have the same problem. During the democratic movement, I was Secretary General for 10 years. I retired about 2 or 3 years ago. We've always held that where the ODM is very popular, candidates must be chosen through universal suffrage. And I will tell you that the primaries produce a lot of conflict within the party. First of all, the party does not have the capacity and capability to run a primary the way the Independent Electoral Commission can run it for the nation. And both the ODM and Jubilee, I tried in the election of 2013 to approach the IEBC, the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, to run our primaries for us. The IEBC gave one excuse. At that point in time, if the IEBC ran our primaries and there was conflict, the only way that those conflicts could be solved is for us to go to the IEBC to arbitrate. So they said, we cannot run your primaries and then sit as a judge when conflict arises, so we shall not. Now, political parties have to decide what is the best method of identifying a candidate for elections. Because political parties are like clubs. I belong to the Nairobi Club. The Nairobi Club is conducting their elections. There are no primaries. You ask people to post their names, they want to stand, they stand, members vote by secret ballot, nobody campaigns, okay? And after about a week, the club decides who has won through that method. And that method is accepted by members as legitimate and practical. So the thing is that members of a political party must decide as members what are the rules of the game they are going to use for identifying candidates. Provided they agree on the rules, that is most important. Now, I'm making this point because the universal suffrage, the idea of going to the people, for the people to decide for you who your candidate is not necessarily legitimate. Because, first of all, in our case, for example, this time, the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission insisted that we must have members of the party to choose the candidates. Now, when you go to the people, they say, all of us are members of the party. Why are you discriminating? Say, you didn't pay. No, but just because I'm poor, you are now discriminating against me. There are many more issues raised about parties choosing candidates than we can tell. Of course, you are right that party honchos or party